Excellent. Okay, I think we're ready to go then. Thanks for joining us in our intimate little gathering here.
Sorry we're late to the start.
We were engrossed in conversations and resetting GoToMeeting. Um, so yeah, we're here today to talk about our work related to essentially doing the assessment work around the content that is registered in the Data Management Training Clearinghouse. The Data Management Training Clearinghouse, if you're not familiar with it, and we have some backup slides so we could actually dive much more deeply if there's a desire. Is a platform that was started development in 2016 in an effort to start to bring together a curated collection of data management training materials, whether they were PowerPoint slides, PDF training documents, videos, other types of tutorials, creating a curated collection of those materials that would provide, that were documented using the LRMI standard metadata standard to facilitate their discovery and reuse, as there's a growing recognition that this rapidly increasing inventory of training materials out on the internet, we're increasingly potentially reinventing the wheel. So if we can have a place where we can go to try to find existing training materials that also has information not just about the materials themselves, but also about the license terms and such about those materials, would encourage reuse and repurposing and adaptation, and perhaps in some cases even community adoption and maintenance, depending on who was developing them and what the underlying model was. It was originally developed in collaboration with Data One, USGS, their Community for Data Integration, ESIP, and ESIP.
And he's
I was trying to think. It was no, there wasn't. And we're now in our second year of a 3-year project funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Science Services to essentially enhance the Data Management Training Clearinghouse, where that enhancement includes looking at how we might extend the metadata model and the associated search capabilities for the clearinghouse, continue to expand and diversify the content of the clearinghouse, where we've now got nearly 400 items in the clearinghouse, making that search and metadata model all the more important. And then outreach, doing outreach, especially to the library community, to expand the visibility and use of this growing collection of training materials, as libraries have often assumed the role in their institutions of supporting research data and its effective management. And then in the context of what we're talking about here, looking at strategies to be able to build assessment capacity around the content of the clearinghouse, understanding that we have a growing collection of training materials, and there are a number of stakeholders in the process of creating those materials, curating those materials, folks that are using or reusing those materials, and then learners that all have a potential interest in being able to provide or use feedback on those materials and the use of those materials in training situations. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
What portion of the material, the 400 plus items that are in the clearinghouse, would you say are really specific to earth sciences as opposed to being perhaps more generically applicable across multiple disciplines?
I would say that the biggest proportion is a sort of research data management generally, but of the disciplinary kinds of information, it's earth science is probably the biggest, because we started that way,
right.
And we're starting to get a lot more in agriculture and oceanography. That's still earth science is different from your definition,
right.
but it's still very science oriented. There's
right.
a little bit more with arts and humanities, but not much.
Right.
But yeah, the biggest proportion is really earth sciences.
And what proportion of the overall would data management, more generic data management versus the
Ooh,
discipline?
good question. Do you have that? There is a slide.
I'm not
There's
trying
a
to hang this
yeah.
up.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember if that
It's
that
at the bottom.
survived.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's at the back here.
Or I can check it.
We
with you
have-
later. I'll
Yeah,
prepare a
that's, I
session.
mean, we could find out more. I could
yeah,
find
here
out
we
more
go. Here's
specifically.
our content diversity.
Yeah, now
by-
this was done a while back, but,
yeah, this was from an analysis we did over the summer.
right, so that's probably 350.
Yeah.
Instead of 400. But, and we're starting to add more in some of these other areas, but,
Okay, great, thank you.
and, but part of what we're trying to do, as Carl said, is to diversify with other
Right.
sciences, so.
Yep.
Okay.
And that's one of IMLS's particular
Yeah.
interests
Goal, the interest, yeah,
in
goals.
terms of this project.
Yeah.
Okay, so and so we've been approaching this assessment question from a number of perspectives, and I've totally, totally off off the track. But what we've been doing is approaching this perspective from, or this assessment activity from, in many respects, looking at existing assessment capabilities that have been developed elsewhere. And as a part of that, we have looked at the Data One EVA tool, which is an outcome of the Data One project and their education work team in terms of developing a set of nearly 90 evaluation questions that are categorized using a number of dimensions. We'll take a look at that in a few minutes. But they did a lot of work in trying to develop a curated collection of evaluation questions that you can mix and match to meet what your particular assessment requirements are. Talking to especially the education community here in ESIP through a couple of breakout sessions at the summer meeting in Tacoma, where we were able to get some good guidance. Thank you. Some good input in terms of how we might prioritize the focus areas for our assessment and for the material, which is leading us to how we narrow down sort of the assessment tiers. And we'll talk about the tiered model we're using in just a moment. To be most realistic in terms of what we can accomplish within the scope of our assessment work for the current IMLS project, but also being able to set the stage for more comprehensive assessment work, we would hope, in being able to bring in additional funding and support for being able to expand the assessment capabilities once we have established sort of a baseline. The assessment capabilities also relate to our metadata enhancement, because that's one area where, with the collection of assessment feedback, we can also potentially feed that into our search and discovery and presentation capabilities in the clearinghouse to provide full circle to help refine further the ability of clearinghouse users to even further identify what materials may be relevant to their particular use. So as a part of our work, we have a working group as a part of our IMLS project that has been convening regularly for the past several months to work through a process of looking at first identifying sort of what our scope and steps are going to be in the near term, to get some feedback from the community in terms of what we're going to try to do. And that has now been actually looking at the set of evaluation questions that the EVA tool was developed around as a way to look at a potential initial pool of assessment questions that we want to potentially integrate into the clearinghouse for soliciting feedback on the materials. So the sort of two areas or opportunities for assessment fall into these broad categories. There's essentially the pre-publication stage. So as we have a workflow, as new educational materials or training materials are identified, we register them into the system as basically new content that needs to be evaluated, documented, and run through an editorial process, and then ultimately published. Or if determined that they're not quite aligned with the acceptance policies for the clearinghouse, they get shunted off to the side.
Or sometimes referred to
Or-
other places. For instance, if there are suggestions for best practices, we send those information about those to Data One because they've got that as part of their skill building hub. So
Mhm.
cooperate together with other partners.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's sort of this pre-publication assessment, in which we are looking for some characteristics of those learning resources in terms of best practices and usability and such, so that they can meet some minimum criteria in terms of quality and completeness. And then we have the post-publication assessment, which in many respects relates more to sort of the EVA tool assessment
Yep.
and the development of the assessment capabilities that we're developing that would be more outwardly facing, where our pre-publication assessment is more embedded in our internal workflow with our clearinghouse editors. So in terms of the post-publication assessment, one initial area for focus that was certainly came out in our summer meeting discussions as one that is more feasible is surveys and assessment involving the learners and being able to essentially get their feedback according to or in alignment with, in this case, we're using Kirkpatrick's four levels of training for learning materials, for training materials. And as we go up in this pyramid from reaction through learning, behavior, and results, each of these levels depends somewhat on feedback, especially learning, behavior, and results, depends somewhat on the identification of more specific criteria. So if you're going to assess learning, you have to actually define what your learning objectives are before you can assess whether or not you've succeeded in meeting them. If you're trying to determine what behaviors you might have actually affected in terms of these are changes in behavior that are around more effective data management, you have to define what those behaviors are. And similarly, if you're wanting to measure results, those are actual material organizational changes that may have come out of training or access to particular training. You have to, again, have some way of defining what those anticipated results are, where you can, so that you can define questions or other instruments for being able to assess those results. The reaction level is the one that I think all of us are probably most familiar with in going through training activities, as that is essentially the immediate response of the learner to the training experience that they just went through. And that is, typically those questions about, how effective was the training session? Did it meet your immediate needs? Did it present what you expected? Were the materials that were presented clear and usable? Was the room the right temperature? The sort of that immediate feedback on the training event, and that provides then the information needed by the trainer or the developer of the content to be able to iterate quickly based on that reaction. So that's the most straightforward, but also in many cases sort of the most superficial. But it is a starting point, and it is also where, unsurprisingly, we're starting as sort of the strongest emphasis. But as we'll see in a second, there are actually potential questions that in the EVA tool that actually address all four levels, and they do so in a way that still allow you to do a fairly quick turnaround post-training survey of your learners to be able to get some feedback that relate to these other criteria, but there's the understanding of these are still sort of anticipated outcomes as opposed to observed outcomes. But we'll talk about that in a minute. But essentially, this is the model that we're using for conceptualizing the different aspects of assessment, the different levels of assessment that we're working in. But then over here on the left, we also have these two sort of high-level areas of assessment that we have as a part of the project. There's the clearinghouse assessment, which we're not focusing on here, but it is another aspect of assessment in the context of the project in terms of usability and use of the clearinghouse itself. That's a separate, but
Next.
But yeah, exactly. And then our focus is more on the content. And this is a question that commonly comes up when we talk about the assessment is, what is your focus? And in this case, we are focusing on the content. And even more so, at this point, it's the assessment in the context of usage of the content, where it's the feedback from learners when they are exposed to, I almost said subjected to, but let's say exposed to, or they go through a training event, and we want to be able to get their reaction and potentially assess, collect some information for these other levels in the evaluation process. But we also potentially want to get feedback from the teachers, as in some cases they're adapting the materials that have been developed by others. They may be using their own materials. And one of the capabilities that we've talked about being able to provide by having this assessment capacity within the clearinghouse is that we can potentially provide a standardized assessment platform that instructors can use even for their own material that that allows them to do assessment that they otherwise might not have the capability or time to develop on their own. So this can become a value-added capability on top of content that's been even developed by trainers, and in their own use of their training materials, they can potentially use the assessment tools that are available to and around the content in the clearinghouse. So I've already alluded to these other and sort of these tiered dependencies in terms of being able to address these four tiers in terms of, you have to understand what it is you're wanting to measure the reaction of. You need to have learning objectives if you want to try to assess learning. You have to have target behaviors before you can assess behavior. You have to know what your performance indicators are before you can really talk about or try to measure what results you have achieved in moving towards those or increasing your capabilities in those performance indicators. So now what we're going to do, and this is a good time for any questions that might come up. We were going to first just take a quick look at the EVA tool itself, just so you have some familiarity with sort of where the pool of questions we've initially started working with came from and how they're sort of organized in that tool. And then we'll look at our sort of extraction of those questions and the associated metadata about the questions so that we have been able to slice and dice through those. And we'll finish up with a survey that we've developed that we've provided to our advisory board for the project. Did we get it to our assessment working group yet? I think we're going to do it at our next meeting with the assessment working group.
Yeah.
But we're also taking opportunities as we're interacting with other communities to get their feedback on essentially the subset of questions that we've identified through this sort of two-step filtration process that we'll walk through to get more broader feedback on what subset of questions might be most informative from a number of perspectives. And that comes back to, the original title of the session, which is the focus on learners and teachers, and the assessment perspectives related to those populations. So if we go to the Data One education evaluation site, the EVA tool. Yes, absolutely.
One question. In a previous slide, you mentioned this. I know that it seems like the focus here is on the post-assessment of the existing resources, not the pre-publication. But you mentioned in the pre-publication that there was a editorial judgment that potentially could be made that certain resources are more appropriate for this ESEF data management training clearinghouse. Other resources are more appropriate for Data One resource. And I was just curious because that's a distinction that's kind of lost on me. You know, as a user, I wouldn't necessarily care whether the resource was hosted in one place or another. I'm just trying to find, you know, the resource that best serves my needs. So what was the justification for kind of that filter on which resources go where? And what is that dividing line between those two different?
Well, what originally, what the selection criteria has said since more or less the beginning is that what we're looking for are resources that people can kind of download and take on their own.
Right.
So so that sometimes means that, for instance, if there's a lot of times this happens with some of the research libraries are just putting up pathfinders that are web pages, you know, that are fairly static and fairly generic and not that different from others. So that kind of thing, the fact that it's a fairly static page is something that we usually, you know, rank lower. And often and part of the reason is because you know, going back to find out if those are still current is a real maintenance issue, you know, in terms of keeping the content in the clearinghouse as current and useful as possible. In the case of the best practices, that those are often show up in that kind of form. So if, for instance, the way we would use it, the best practices would be more somebody's created a tutorial or some sort of a video or something that refers to that PDF or that best practice. There could be what we would do is include the description, in the description, the fact that there's a best practice and a URL to that, but not have a record of it itself in the clearinghouse. Again, for maintenance reasons and because of that kind of static type of resource. So the fact that Data One is collecting these and putting them in their skill building hub is something we can point to, because that's a more almost robust and rigorous and continuous source of that. The URL will be resolved there more frequently oftentimes than the other places. So those are the sorts of criteria that.
So I'm still confused about the distinction between Data One skill building hub versus the data management clearinghouse.
Yeah, so the skill building hub actually has a couple of roles, because Data One itself, they develop training materials.
And they're in the clearinghouse.
And they are registered in the clearinghouse. And those are also included in their skill building hub. But within the skill building hub as well, there are collections of best practices, which don't meet the same selection criteria that we have in terms of training materials. So their skill building hub is sort of a superset of the types of materials that we would typically register in the clearinghouse. That having been said, one of the other key characteristics of the clearinghouse that it is purely a metadata search platform. We are not a repository for training materials. The training materials remain distributed out at whatever sites, organizations are creating and maintaining those training materials.
Hopefully maintained.
Yeah. So when we talk about Data One training materials that are housed within their skill building hub, only a subset of those materials are registered in the clearinghouse.
Because the items registered in the clearinghouse are meant to be items that can stand on their own as training materials. They're
Right.
not meant to
Mhm.
just be these high-level lists
Right.
of principles or.
Right.
Right, or an
Exactly.
FAQ
Yeah,
or
yeah.
something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
That helps.
So yeah, and that's one of the other questions that often comes up in terms of, so, you're storing these,
Yeah.
we're curating them in terms of documenting them, building metadata around them, providing a unified search interface for them, and providing access links to be able to get to them. But those access links are pointing outward to wherever they exist at their home locations.
It's part of partly it's a scoping
Yeah.
issue, yeah. Good question.
Yeah.
So if I,
Maybe we
Open
want to
up.
just go to our own version of it to show the tool too. You could do it that way.
yeah.
Because that's
So-
the next slide.
Yeah, so I was just going to quickly show, so this is Data One's site. And as a matter of fact, the PowerPoint with the live links is also available through the Schedule
Okay.
for the
Yeah,
session.
yeah.
So you can follow up or follow along, whatever you'd like. But basically what Data One did is they also have metadata that they created, in this case, for the 89 evaluation questions that they identified through their literature review around evaluation. They also used the Kirkpatrick levels as a way to characterize the 89 questions that they have. But interestingly, they don't expose those Kirkpatrick levels through their search interface here at the top of the tool. But that classification is it's exposed in the information that shows up for each of the questions. So that's what this learning or reaction, they look like tags, and they function as sort of tags in the system. But it also then has some additional characteristics as to whether or not what the obligation is in terms of their suggestion, whether it should be a mandatory question, an optional question, a recommended question. And then they also have information about a suggested question type that would be related to this, in terms of, you can see as an example here, they suggested it would be a scalar question with these potential options for a respondent to have access to. So the really nice thing is that this can be exported as a Word doc, as a spreadsheet, or even as a format that you can import into Opinio. So if you're using Opinio as a survey instrument, you could actually choose a set of questions and export it and import it directly into your survey system. Or as we did for our project, we actually exported the Excel spreadsheet of all 89 questions, which brought with it the metadata, all of the metadata fields, in a way that we were able to slice and dice through them in a more straightforward fashion. So if we go back to our next slide, we have the link to our Google spreadsheet. Where we created a number of tabs, and this started out as essentially the exported spreadsheet from the EVA tool, and we added these first two columns, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But then there's the question itself, the Kirkpatrick level. So this is where, while again, it's not exposed through the search interface in their site, it is one of the metadata columns that once we export it, we actually can slice and dice based on those criteria. Then the obligation, the suggested answers.
Obligation just means when you give them the survey, are they required to answer the question?
Right. And at least that's their suggestion.
Yeah,
So it is,
yeah.
and it also, for us, provided some suggested filter conditions where for prioritizing which questions we might want to pull out as initial subset to
You're not
consider
gonna
as
ask someone
candidates.
83 questions or-
Right, exactly.
Not get any answers.
Yes. So then what we did was we went through, and this, I started to break the spreadsheet by adding these, these different columns. We started out with just this column of basically check marks or yes, no values for candidate questions that we were thinking would be useful to consider. And we did that through setting up filter conditions. And in this case, I'm wondering if I should, or if I can open it up in Excel. Or let me see. Oh, we ran into this yesterday, where we can't edit it, but I can download it. That's what I can do. Download it as an Excel spreadsheet, and hopefully it will let me, because then I can show you that, it's basically just the Excel tools for being able to do row-based filtering and selection to be able to, again, sort of take advantage of the metadata that's associated with the question, so we can not just have to read each one on its own and try to do a consideration of each one, because apparently I'm just lazy. And let's see, did we get that downloaded? Let's see here. Yeah, there we go. We can maybe make that slightly more legible. So in this case, what we did was we took advantage of these filter capabilities. Let's make this a little taller. You can read the whole headings. So we, for example, we focused on in or post-training evaluation. Turning off the others if I remember correctly. Was that?
You need to click in post.
Oh, there we go.
Yep.
And we actually then filtered on each level so that we could look at the subset of questions associated with each of those levels. And then we further limited them in terms of, well, mandatory or recommended. In this case, optional for the behavioral questions. Behavior questions don't exist, but for reaction, there actually are some optional questions.
Maybe we should filter on reaction.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's go
Instead of
back
behavior.
to reaction.
More anyway.
Yeah. So now you can see we've got some optional ones. And so we chose to exclude the optional questions. So now we only have the mandatory and recommended. So this is essentially how we were able to narrow down to a smaller subset for each of these levels in the Kirkpatrick hierarchy. And essentially then export those for more detailed consideration. And this is basically the process we went through for each of those Kirkpatrick levels for the in or post training evaluation for either the mandatory or recommended. And from that, we then developed our survey tool, which, so if we get down here, and this is what we're using to then collect feedback from our advisory board, our assessment working group, and anybody else who's willing to talk to us.
Yes, Raleigh and Layla.
So if we open the survey, basically what we've done in the survey is set it up so that we can have a little bit of description of sort of what we've already talked about in terms of some of the criteria, the characteristics of the items and how we identified the questions that we're using. And we say, okay, once we've read that. And this comes to one of the other dimensions that we identified, and this comes to those now, that proliferation of columns that we were seeing in the spreadsheet, where we started out with a primary focus on, okay, I am an instructor who is wanting to get feedback from my learners. Sort of the most common scenario as we're talking about some of these training material assessments. But we then started to recognize that given the nature of the clearinghouse and its content, that it's worthwhile thinking about a number of different participants in this assessment process. And those different participants bring some different perspectives and may have different needs in terms of the questions that they would like to ask and from whom they would like to get that information. So in this case, we have the first two questions relate to the information user. So you could think of that as, who is the person who is administering the survey? Who is going to be the end user of the information collected through the survey instrument? And the three personas that we identified here is essentially the content creator, who could also be the instructor, you know, if they're one and the same. But this provides an opportunity for recognizing the fact that since we're registering content into the clearinghouse that is created by this global universe of content creators, there is potentially a high probability of the content creator being different from the instructor who's using it in any particular occasion. So we wanted to be able to separate those. And then also we have this category of our reviewers and editors. They may be looking for some different information than the content creator or the instructor, the person who actually delivered the training. You know, as an example, the content creator is likely to be primarily focused on feedback on the content itself, not necessarily on questions about the learning space or the quality of the instructor, or if though that can from a creator's perspective, I think that would be useful context for me. If the feedback was that the instructor in general was terrible, I might look askance at how the materials were reviewed in the context of an otherwise terrible instructor experience. but you know, where the focus would be in terms of the information you're looking for could be different. Where an instructor would certainly be looking for feedback on the quality of the instruction itself, in addition to the content, in addition to potentially even the facility and logistics of the training event. So we initially wanted to be able to differentiate those information user perspectives. So if we select this, then we also are saying, okay, from whom do we want to actually get this feedback? Is it going to be from learners, folks that are receiving training? Is it from instructors? So again, if you're a creator and your content is being reused, it could be really useful to get feedback from other instructors, the users of your content, on aspects of your materials that you've developed. Again, our clearinghouse reviewers or editors, or in this case, it could also be feeding into our search and discovery capabilities for being able to do relevance scoring or other ways to present or summarize reviews that are coming in. So
which is something that people have requested, definitely. So.
Yep. So in this case, we choose learners. So if we look back now, in this instance, we're completing the survey from the perspective of a content creator as a user of the information, and then as questions they would be wanting to pose to learners. Okay. So you know, as an individual, if you are interested in potentially envisioning multiple personas and the differences, you could potentially respond to the survey 9 times with each of the mappings between those different users and information providers. The more likely scenario is that respondents are likely to think of themselves as being informed on being able to fulfill a role as a content creator or an instructor and,
Or a user.
or a
student,
user,
yeah.
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 But you know, there may be some overachievers
Yeah.
out there. And then we have the questions themselves, and basically we just set it up so that each of those categories of questions by reaction, learning, behavior, and result, we pulled out. In this case, because there were a fair number of reaction ones, we broke it into 2 sections: mandatory and recommended, so that essentially the respondents can rate them. So they can say, oh, the content, that's really important. And in this case, it's nice because we can actually drag them and you can. So this is where, hopefully through the collection of additional feedback, including an option to say, you know, data 1 may have thought that this was a reasonable question, but in this particular context, as we're thinking about this combination of user and feedback provider, it may not be relevant in this context. We're in a position where we can essentially get ranked ordering of questions from our various respondents that will help inform our decision-making process for what are likely to be the most relevant questions for us to integrate into what would likely be an 8 to 10 question survey that we may want to.
So if I understand correctly, right, you're posing a process to evaluate the survey
right
now. You're not actually deploying the survey.
So this is
ranking.
Yeah.
Correct.
So I've only semi-humorously described this as the assessment.
Okay. Yeah. You're having the people who have a vested interest in assessing these tools put on the hat of, you know, who would be providing the tool and to whom.
Yep.
And then given that, you know, perspective of from whom to whom, ranking what they think are the most important questions
Right.
under each of these categories.
Right. Because ultimately, you know, the clearinghouse ends up being a broker. We are positioned between content creators, instructors, and learners. And again, in some cases, they're one and the same, even our learners, as they may be looking for materials for self-paced learning.
Right. A lot more.
And so in the spirit of recognizing that we're not posing these questions to solely satisfy our interests, we thought that it would actually be good to try to get broader input in terms of what are the questions that folks think would be most value to get asked and answered in these various contexts.
And part of what we're trying to do too is to get kind of a universe of questions that we could ask. We're going to have, you know, there may well be phases in which the tool, the clearinghouse itself, you know, provides the mechanism for getting feedback, getting assessment, and in phase 1 or phase 2. So if we have, you know, if we can sort of cull the top few and put that in, and then get some feedback on that from you know, users in the real situation, then that'll give us some information too, and we can go back. We've got, you know, a year and a half to almost 2 years to do this yet. So if we can, you know, or either that or do it, do it with the things that people think are most important of the mandatory, but others come up, or there are questions that people don't, that are not part of this.
And in some respects, we have the luxury of a little bit of extra time for really nailing down and iterating on this assessment process, because we found ourselves in this second year of the project out of necessity actually having to rebuild the clearinghouse from the ground up because of announced end of life for the existing Drupal platform that it was originally developed on. And of course, that announcement came only months after the
Right.
project started. And the end of life was scheduled for, and they may have now finally pushed it back a little bit, as maybe there was enough gnashing of teeth and moaning and groaning. But it was still only going to be a handful of months after the end of our project. So making investments in enhancing, as far as the code is concerned, a clearinghouse based on a technology that was that was going to be end of life essentially within months after the end of the project was not going to be a very attractive prospect.
Plus it's more portable, if it moves from ESIP to other environments too, or somebody wants to
Right.
clone it, or, it's a distributed sort of thing, which, may well be, hopefully it's in the future.
Yeah.
So,
I don't need to belabor the point, but there are then just sections of the survey relating to we organized it by those 4 levels, and then mandatory or recommended, at least for learning and reaction, because there were large numbers of questions for each of those, so we subdivided. When we got down to behavior, there were a smaller number of questions, so we pooled together the mandatory and recommended, because there are only, in this case, 7 questions, and for results, only 5 questions. And then any other comments and any additional questions, and some follow-up contact information. So with this, I think we may have still 1 response from our advisory board.
You're the one who sees it.
Yeah,
I haven't seen
and
it.
I'm trying to remember, because I now have 3
one
or
max.
4. I have 3 or 4 surveys that we've been pointing people at over the last 48 or 72 hours. So I'm periodically getting notifications for other responses, but I haven't dug in to see which surveys people are responding to. But we're still basically very early in the process of collecting this feedback on the assessment questions that we're posing. And so our primary goal here is to provide an update and have a conversation around sort of the strategy that we've been developing so far, and certainly recruit folks to participate in the survey.
Well, did you want me to take the survey?
Absolutely.
Maybe I feel like that would be a good thing for me to do first, so then I can be more informed to comment on it.
Sure.
And what process it might.
And I don't know if Layla's still on, I think.
Looks like she is, but did you have any questions, Layla?
I just had more of a question about implementation, but maybe that's too far down the line.
No, we'd be happy to. Do you have a specific question, or just our general plan?
Well, more along the plan of looking at the clearinghouse. How do you expect to be able to assess learners since they're jumping off from the actual clearinghouse? How do you bring them back to give them the assessment?
Right, and the strategy there is actually as a part of, and this is especially as a part of the new version of the clearinghouse, where we'll have additional ways of presenting the information about the learning materials. The expectation is that we will be able to provide links for assessment tools that are associated with each of the training objects, so that ultimately the surveys would be administered by the teacher, the instructors. So if it's an instruction session assessment, we would be reliant upon the instructors who are using a particular training object to use the assessment survey that we've provided. And we would have a way to link that particular, the set of responses to that object in the database. So we'd be able to tether it to that, now, as I said earlier, one of now close to 400 training objects. So they'd be, the responses would be associated with those individual training objects. And then we would be able to provide reports back to the instructor and the creator, and this comes back to the different interests
Right.
that those users of the survey have in terms of information they're looking for, being able to provide reports back to them that are relevant to their particular interests and needs.
The other thing that we're planning to do that's sort of part of this is really work to either develop or adapt or add on to a community of practice for teachers and for learners. So we're talking about partnering with carpentries and other folks who are learning how to teach data skills. And so the more that the teachers of those skills know about what's the best way to teach them, and having a conversation among each other, between each other about how to do that, the more incentive there is for teachers to do this kind of assessing, provide ways of doing the assessing, and also the learners as well. If they know that their comments and contributions are adding to others' experiences, it's sort of a crowdsourcing approach, and there's no way to really tie it down because most of the time we're not in that setting of students facing the teacher and being required to do it, but the whole idea is to kind of lift all how does that go?
Lift all the boats.
Lift all the boats. It's the wrong, say it wrong, but that's the idea too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really interesting. And do you plan to do that for like longitudinal tracking as well? Because I know you talked about that a little earlier, looking at how are people using the information that they learned down the line.
Yeah, and this is where, especially those higher levels in Kirkpatrick's model, become challenging, because as he describes them, those are the challenges that are posed by those higher learning level. Are when you talk about changing behavior, that is best assessed sometime after the initial opportunity, learning experience, and the same with results, and for that matter, meeting some particular learning objectives. I think we've recognized that both because of the relatively short duration of the current project, but also just in terms of available resources and level of effort, we're not in a position within the current project to try to do set up a longitudinal framework for doing this assessment, but instead we're leveraging the more, I don't know, it's more statement of intention and statement of immediate perceived benefit by learners in many respects, on anticipated impact related to learning behavior and results, rather than the more robust method of saying, okay, you took this training session a year ago. What are the ways in which you have materially changed the way you manage your data, as opposed to, I have learned this really cool thing and I intend to always create well-structured spreadsheets from this day forward.
New Year's resolutions.
Right. Exactly. But that's not something that we can take on within the scope of this project, but that's where also, we're wanting to keep those additional capabilities on our radar as we're looking, as Nancy was talking about, looking for opportunities for collaboration on new projects and initiatives, how we may be able to develop shared assessment capabilities that are more reusable and scalable across training materials, across training opportunities. Because that longitudinal approach is, that remains sort of the gold standard, especially for some of those higher Kirkpatrick levels. But that's not something we can realistically take on at this point.
Great, thanks. That makes a lot of sense.
Good.
Achieving anything that even vaguely resembles 3 words in a sentence at this point in the day makes me happy.
I was talking about our idea.
Oh,
The way
I was just thinking about trying to explain it.
as well as your explanation of it, yes.
So I can offer some initial feedback on going through this.
Oh, great.
So one initial, I know you've probably already kind of developed this and you don't want to change it too much.
Well,
One thing,
given the very small responses we have so far.
one thing that is just kind of like a technical thing, but the way that the ranking is presented, there's kind of a default order that appears. And so I'm concerned that in the ordering that I'm presenting right now, I'm biased toward what just happened to be at the top of the list versus what happened to be at the bottom.
Right.
Because as soon as you move one widget around, it automatically puts the numbers. Well, I don't know if there's a way to change that display. Like you could still keep the same list, but have it so you have to drag it from one box over to the other side.
Well, and I anticipated that there could be an issue with that, more with responses and non-responses.
Yeah.
So if I'm remembering correctly, and I'd have to look back at my design, but I'm pretty sure that I actually initially randomized the order of the questions in each one of the boxes. So that because you're right, if you use the drag method, it automatically ranks them from top to bottom.
Yeah, exactly.
But given that they should be randomized in their order, we would hopefully have sort of a baseline smeared score.
Yeah. Are they randomized separately for each individual user?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'll get, like, if I were to start this again, I would get a different randomized order.
That is my expectation.
Yeah.
I could, because I thought of exactly that thing, and I was like, okay, yeah, because any of these ranking exercises have exactly that risk where people peter out as
especially
they
if there's like 20 different things.
Yes.
It's a little bit difficult.
You said the questions are randomized? The
The
ranking
ordering
of the responses.
the individual EVA questions within each block,
Right.
the order of the choices that they're ranking
Okay.
is randomized.
I see. Okay.
So this is the content of the resource relevant.
Right. May not
That
always be first.
It's not always going to be
Okay.
first.
Right. Okay. Okay.
That's at least my recollection.
It makes sense.
Again, I've been making a bunch of surveys lately.
It's built in.
I did have one comment on the survey.
Yes.
You might, I don't know if this was completely intentional, but the comments boxes, you keep them very short. Do you mean to do that on purpose?
No, that was actually a default.
Okay.
SurveyMonkey used to give some tools for actually adjusting the size of them, but they've reduced those options. I think it can grow, but
It looks like it just, so you don't have a text area, it's just a long text field that doesn't wrap. So that might be a little difficult for your survey participants, so they can't really see what they're writing. Just that was the only thing that I saw that might help.
yeah, for sure. And I'll revisit that because I was not satisfied with that either.
Maybe there's an option in the design as you start it out.
Because as I said previously, and they may have just moved the option for like specifying the number of lines of the box. Yeah, this is remarkably and satisfyingly meta as we're getting feedback on our feedback for the assessment.
Of data management.
This also might seem really elementary, but just in your questions where you're ranking, you might cue the participant to drag and drop or rank, move them around just so that they have a little more clarity in what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, because there are the two options,
Right.
the drag and drop or the individual ranking.
Yeah.
Actually, when I built it, I had forgotten about the drag and drop until that was the first thing that our collaborator Sophie discovered and commented on. It's like, oh yeah, I'd forgotten about that. Making it really easy to change the rankings, but then it also results in that default
Yeah,
that
that's
default
really
ranking.
challenging. So I completed my survey.
Oh,
One
excellent,
other
thank you.
immediate response was that there's a little bit of apples and oranges here. Some of the questions are quantitative, like was this a useful resource? Or like how would you rate this resource? Which presumably would be like a 1 to 5 scale.
Right, right.
And there are others that are like, what is your preferred method for learning about data management? And maybe that will be a menu of like 5 options, but I could also see that as being like a qualitative response. And in terms of, I submitted from the perspective of reviewer, reviewing for deployment of the content to a learner. Because I was kind of thinking with my like former NSF add-on, like, if I were a program officer, I would just share this with PIs, being able to assess like the quality of the resources for the PIs who would be the learner type people. And where I was going with this. If you want just like a quick and dirty comparison of like a large number of resources, the quantitative metrics I could see as being like the best for kind of an initial sorting, like like kind of your Yelp score.
Right.
We know that Yelp scores are highly imperfect, and you have to like ultimately read the comment bubbles underneath the Yelp review with the individual Yelp reviews to really know what's going on. So it's good to have those qualitative things. But as like a first pass, you want to know just like quantitatively.
Right.
So I added in, for example, one question just to add is like, what is your overall review of this quality of this resource from 1 to 5? Regardless, I understand the specifics of like reaction, but just like, I mean, maybe it was already contained under one of those specific areas, but
yeah. Well, and I think that actually is a good way to think about how to mix the content, because as I've opened up the spreadsheet again, and you can see that there are text box recommended text box response options and these more quantitative or scored options. And thinking about, and maybe it's more useful in the survey even to maybe include the type of question with the questions themselves to clarify what you're responding to, because
I would
ideally,
say like separately rank the quantitative versus the text box questions.
Right.
There's really 3 kinds. There's the yes, no, or yes, no, maybe type thing. The 1 to 5 scale.
Or maybe even just these scale multiple choice versus
scale multiple choice
open-ended.
Those are the 3.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it feels like comparing a question like how useful is this resource versus please comment on like previous resources you've used. It's like, whoa, I don't even know how to compare those two.
Right.
But comparing, for example, like, what are previous resources used versus like what resource do you expect to use in the future? I can make a more well-formed judgment on which of those I think would be a more useful question.
Yeah.
Okay. On the survey itself you're talking about, right?
Yeah, this is in terms of the meta evaluation, for this current survey for people to evaluate which are the best questions.
Right, okay.
Well, this is very helpful.
Yeah.
Well, I understand if you're like this close to the
I
survey
know.
development for like a day, it's hard to zoom out.
Yeah. Great. Well, anything else?
I think it's great that you're doing this evaluation of the resources because frankly, I mean, one of the things that I struggle with is if I'm sending someone to this like massive resource that contains so many, this massive clearinghouse that contains so many different resources. Yes, you can do a keyword search. Yes, you can do filter by content type. But like we all know, those are like highly imperfect.
Right.
And getting like an actual human evaluation of you know the quality of the resource is going to be so much more valuable in terms of like ranking and like identifying what's going to be most useful for specific
Well,
case.
it also will give us an opportunity to put out these are the best resources for this kind of purpose, for this audience. If you've got early career people and they're interested in oceanography, using R or whatever, then that gives us an opportunity to.
And I don't think I came up in these questions, but I presume when you actually perform these assessments to the users later on, you're going to include some additional contextual questions about like, what is your domain of study? What is your kind of background?
Yeah, and in some cases, as we think about also the sort of the workflow for making a survey available to an instructor, it may be more efficient to actually collect metadata about a particular learning event in terms of this is your audience, this is your, in terms of discipline, in terms of, anticipated level, and being able to attach that as metadata to the collection of responses at the training event level as a complement to what might be some individual level responses from the learners. But that also then relates to, because we have the initial classification by the editor in terms of a potential target audience, if it's discernible, the discipline, so there's a disciplinary alignment, but it also gives us an opportunity for revisiting some of those characterizations if we see that it actually ends up being also highly ranked by other disciplines and it's getting reused in ways we didn't expect, or vice versa. If we see it's getting used by the target audience that we thought, but for some reason they're not finding it particularly useful or not as well aligned as we thought it was, that could provide some guidance for reassessing how it was classified in the first place. That's predicated on enough use of any of the resources to be able to establish the signal.
Well, and you're kind of, I mean, I'm sure there's been other kinds of like learning assessments performed before on other curricular materials, but I've never heard of anything like this being done for data management training materials. So you're the pioneer.
We get people to play with us.
Yes,
especially
exactly.
the creators. I think one of the other things we'll be able to do with this, if we can provide it, is there are groups of people, organizations that are creating resources, like the Australian Research Data Commons. They've got a group of resources on data management that we could offer that response, provide this mechanism, and then get that back. And so that's a service that we could provide too, or foster in the UK. So there's an advantage that they have not only to hear the responses or apply them to the resources when people actually land on their resource, but also give us information that will help us do that pre-publication assessment as well, to give people give accurate information about target audience, make sure their learning objectives are there, make sure there's a PID, identifier, make sure it's in a place that's going to be persistent, that the license shows up, that sort of thing. All of that stuff that is important for making things fair, but also put air quotes fair, but also it's reusable. And then credit goes back to the creators in the organization too. So it starts that cycle of authority and credibility for the people who are creating them. again, if they'll play. So,
Great. Oh, we have somehow managed to take
yeah.
our
Oh,
full time.
is it? Oh, it is. My goodness.
Well, we started like
We
half
did
an
start.
hour
We
ago,
did,
know,
we
so-
did. Well, thank you both
Yeah.
of you for sticking with us on this and
Yeah.
our modified approach. But I
Right.
think it actually turned out very well for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
definitely.
hopefully for you
What
as well.
I mean, my general closing comment is I think what you're doing is really valuable. I know it,
Good,
it
it's good
could
to hear.
probably seem a little bit tedious
Yeah.
at time going through all these different spreadsheets, but I mean, I feel like there's just so many situations where people prepare surveys, but
Mhm.
there hasn't been appropriate kind of deliberation, or sorry, assessments, but there
Yeah.
hasn't been appropriate deliberation about what should be in the assessment.
Yeah,
The fact that
yeah.
you're doing this, I mean, it's, yes, it's tedious and it requires a lot of cajoling of people to do
Yeah,
the survey,
yeah.
but like the fact that you're actually getting people with like the appropriate expertise to be
Mhm.
evaluating the assessment
Right, right.
is, I think, a very valuable.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We'd have to send a reminder to the advisory board.
Right, exactly.
Offer them chocolate or something. I
Yeah.
don't know, but
Yeah.
And give Matt a reward.
Matt a reward, that's right. Plaque. Any questions again for Lila? Anything else for you?
No, this was great. Thanks for all the information. Really appreciate it. You guys are doing great work.
Your name?
Oh, both work. I go by Leela, but I'll respond to both.
We have a similar name.
That's true.
All sorts of
That's right.
Raleigh.
All right,
Great, well, thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.